Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to find out they were orchestrating your heartbreak behind your back? What if the person you thought would protect your heart was the very one handing it to someone else? Picture this. It's your anniversary. You've set the table, you're 7 months pregnant, and tonight was supposed to be a celebration of love, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, things could still work. But instead, the man you married is out across town, holding someone else's hand, smiling at someone else's eyes, whispering promises you were meant to hear. That's exactly what happened to Camille Worthington. And what her husband Everett didn't know was that the quiet, graceful woman he'd taken for granted was about to walk through that restaurant door. He thought he was ending their marriage in private. Controlled, cold, on his terms. But what came next wasn't a private fallout. It was an explosion, a reckoning. And it happened in front of everyone. Trust me, this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about power, about knowing your worth, about what happens when a woman stops waiting for closure and decides to write the ending herself. Are you ready? Let's begin. It was the silence of thick Moroccan rugs spread across white limestone floors, of quadruple glazed windows that dulled the pulse of downtown LA into a faint, meaningless murmur. To Camille Worthington Langford, that silence had once meant peace. Now it felt like a crypt. At 30, Camille possessed a beauty that seemed suspended in time, delicate yet durable. Her wheat blonde hair framed a face with eyes the color of overcast skies. She moved with the kind of effortless refinement that came from deep Southern lineage. The Worthingtons were Charleston aristocracy, old money with deeper roots than their oak-lined family estate. Her marriage to Everett Langford 5 years ago had been less a love story and more a strategic alliance, blending her storied heritage with his high-octane wealth from bold biotech ventures. They looked like LA's power couple. Their life, from the outside, was immaculate, but behind the scenes, Camille had been unraveling the threads for some time. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, one hand resting protectively over the firm swell of her belly. 7 months along, after years of heartbreak, doctor visits, and fragile hope, this child was their miracle. It was meant to be the patch that closed the hairline fractures in their marriage. Instead, those cracks had splintered wider. Everett had become a phantom in their home. He was physically there, 6'2", always sharp in a bespoke Zegna suit, his cologne a haunting trace long after he'd gone. But his presence, his warmth, his soul, those had vanished. He existed through his phone, his thumbs always in motion, a private knowing smile sometimes curling his lips when she asked who he was texting. The answer never changed. Dismissive, clipped, work cam, always work. Dismissive, clipped, work cam, always work. Tonight was their 5th anniversary. She had hired a private chef, filled their penthouse with the soft music of a jazz pianist she adored, and placed the sapphire necklace Everett gave her on their first anniversary neatly beside his dinner setting. It was a fragile, desperate bid to revive what had faded. At 6 p.m., he exhaled sharply, tossing his briefcase onto the suede settee. He didn't kiss her. He kissed the air near her cheek. "Evening," he muttered, already tugging his tie loose. "Don't wait up. I've got that late dinner with the biotech investors, trying to wrap up the Synertech merger." Camille's heart, which had been beating with quiet hope, sank. "Everett, tonight it's our anniversary." He paused mid-stride toward the bedroom and glanced back. For a fleeting second, there was something in his expression, guilt, maybe, but it vanished as fast as it came, masked by a look of faint irritation. "Right. Damn. Look, Cam, I'm sorry. This deal is huge, billions on the table. We'll celebrate this weekend. I'll take you wherever you want. We'll fly to Milan just for a night. Sound good?" He didn't wait for her response. He disappeared into their vast walk-in closet. The promise of Milan was just another sleight of hand, a flashy distraction meant to cover fresh wounds. It used to work, not anymore. She trailed after him, the whisper of her silk slippers brushing the carpet. "The chef's already here, Everett. I canceled my seat at the children's literacy gala for this." He emerged, buttoning a crisp shirt, eyes locked on his cufflinks. "Well, uncancel it. Or enjoy the dinner solo. Give the chef a fat tip. We can afford it." His cruelty wasn't sharp. It was passive, offhand, and that made it cut deeper. She wasn't even worth a real fight anymore, just another appointment he could shift around. "Where's the dinner?" she asked, voice steady but quiet. "LaRue," he said without pause. "They're sticklers for punctuality." LaRue, the most romantic, impossible-to-book restaurant in L.A., the same place he'd proposed to her. The irony was so thick, so suffocating, Camille thought she might choke on it. A supposed business dinner with biotech investors at the most intimate French restaurant in Los Angeles. The lie wasn't just a lie. It was an affront to her intelligence. She watched Everett mist a touch of cologne across his neck, adjust the platinum clasp on his Vacheron Constantin watch. He looked every bit the billionaire power player. He also looked like someone she didn't recognize. "All right, Everett," she said, her tone revealing none of the hurricane brewing inside her. She smoothed the front of her silk maternity gown. "Have a successful dinner." He gave her a tight, approving smile, clearly satisfied by her calm surrender. "That's my girl. I'll make it up to you. Big time." He leaned in for another performative air kiss and was gone. The heavy front door closed with a muted final click that echoed like a slam chapter in her heart. The silence that followed was even more oppressive. The scent of roasted duck and truffle potatoes now felt grotesque. Camille walked toward the table for two, set with gleaming crystal and polished silver. She stared at the empty chair that should have been filled. The baby gave a gentle kick, a tender reminder of the life inside her, a future she was clinging to. But the fight she was beginning to understand wasn't about saving her marriage. It was about surviving its slow collapse. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She didn't call her mother, not her sister, not her best friend. She called the one person within Everett's orbit whose loyalty had never wavered, a quiet, humble man who always saw more than he let on. "Mr. Lawson," she said softly, "I need a favor. I need to know if my husband has a reservation at LaRue tonight." A long pause followed. Mr. Lawson had been Everett's driver and assistant for nearly 11 years, a man who made silence into an art. But in this silence, she heard confirmation. "Please, Marcus," she whispered, using his first name for the first time in years. "For me," another pause, then a sigh, heavy with reluctant truth. "Mrs. Langford, the reservation is for two, but the second guest, it's not a Mr. Watanabe." The words hung between them, dense and unmovable. She already knew, in her bones. The tomb was cracked, and reality was starting to spill in. Everett Langford steered his custom black Bentley through the glimmering arteries of downtown L.A. with the same ruthless finesse he brought to corporate boardrooms. A rush of adrenaline coursed through Everett, an intoxicating mix of control, suppressed guilt, and heady liberation. Guilt had become a brief, manageable emotion, one he had trained himself to shelve. But freedom was the drug he couldn't quit. And Sienna Blake was his most potent hit yet. He glanced at the passenger seat. Sienna was everything Camille wasn't. Where Camille embodied timeless grace, Sienna radiated raw electricity. Her raven black bob was cut at a bold angle. Her lips, painted a rebellious scarlet, curled into unfiltered laughter. She was 26, an ambitious, rising interior designer Everett had met at a Design Week gala in Miami. A night his wife hadn't attended. She wasn't a gold digger, at least not by his definition. That was the story he told himself. She was driven, sharp, and enamored by his clout, his influence, not merely his fortune. She made him feel alive, visible, desired in a way Camille no longer did. Camille, with her charities, her careful social calendar, and now the quiet rhythms of pregnancy, had come to represent serene, elegant order. A beautiful, high-security cage. Sienna was the open door. And yet, even as he sat beside Sienna, a woman who made his blood run hot and his ego feel invincible, there was a sliver of unease curling at the edges of his mind, an itch beneath the surface he refused to scratch. It whispered in the familiar tone of Camille's laugh, in the memory of her hand resting gently on her belly. But he silenced it, smothered it beneath the roar of his rationalizations. Tonight wasn't about conscience, it was about control. "Are you sure about this, Ev?" Sienna asked, her voice smooth like velvet. She trailed a manicured finger along the polished dashboard of his Bentley. "Your wife, the anniversary. It feels necessary," he cut in smoothly. He reached across the console, gently cradling her hand, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "Camille and I, we've been fading for a long time. What we have now, it's transactional. The baby." He paused. "That was unexpected. A final effort we never thought would work. It's complicated." It was a calculated blend of partial truth and self-serving fiction. They had grown distant. The IVF journey had felt like a gamble. But calling it an accident? That was a lie crafted to ease his conscience, to cast himself as a casualty of circumstance rather than its architect. Somewhere deep down, he knew the lie was cowardice disguised as candor. But he couldn't afford to admit that. To Sienna, to Camille, or to himself. Not now. Not with the fantasy he'd built teetering on the edge of becoming real. Tonight isn't about her, he continued, voice dipping into a low whisper. It's about us. I'm done hiding. I need to start living for myself again. LaRue, it's symbolic. It's where my old life began, and tonight it ends there. Sienna's green eyes widened. Ends? You're telling her tonight? I'm starting the process, he said with cool precision, like a CEO outlining a deal. This dinner is the first move. People will see us. It'll get back to her. That's the point. This was far cleaner than some tear-streaked chaotic confrontation in their home. It was a staggeringly cowardly yet calculated plan, born of a narcissism so embedded that Everett genuinely believed it was the rational choice. By being seen with Sienna, he would accelerate the outcome, create a public truth that forced the separation into Camille's hands, not his. He would become the man who had moved forward. She would become the wife who couldn't keep up. He owned the narrative. He always had. When they arrived at La Rue, the maitre d', a sharply dressed man named Julien, greeted them with the same respectful poise reserved only for the untouchable elite. Mr. Langford, always a pleasure. Your table is ready. Julien's eyes flicked to Sienna for a fraction of a second. The glimmer of surprise quickly replaced by professional composure. He knew Mrs. Langford well. Everett ignored it. He led Sienna through the candlelit dining room, its quiet luxury designed to create the illusion of seclusion. Each table was a world of its own. The air hummed with the scent of saffron, truffles, and power. Heads turned, whispers followed, delicate as lace and just as sharp. He spotted several familiar faces, a venture capitalist, a museum trustee, the editor-in-chief of a culture magazine. Excellent. He had secured the most coveted table, a curved booth in the far corner, with sweeping views of the park. The exact table where he had proposed to Camille. The malice of that choice wasn't incidental. It was a message, a declaration that he could overwrite their history, revise the script, and cast a new lead without hesitation. It's stunning, Sienna said, her earlier nerves dissolving under the gravity of Everett's certainty. Only the best, he replied, signaling the sommelier for a bottle of Cristal. He conveniently overlooked the fact that Camille's OBGYN had asked him not to drink as a gesture of shared sacrifice. As the champagne was poured, his phone buzzed. A text from his COO, an update on the Synertech acquisition. He typed a reply with practiced speed, a surge of pleasure rising in his chest. He could manage everything, his legacy, his mistress, his marriage. He was Everett Langford, and the world adjusted to him. So, Sienna said, leaning in, her eyes alight in the low glow. Tell me about this new chapter. Everett offered a slow, knowing smile. It looks like you. It looks like my jet, only not for a weekend in Milan. For a month in the Seychelles. It looks like your face on the cover of Design Era with the Langford Foundation underwriting your next gallery. It looks like whatever we decide. He was selling her a future, and Sienna was all in. There was no reason for her to question it. Everett lied with the same polished ease that he delivered quarterly projections to shareholders, reassured board members, and soothed his wife's suspicions. He believed his own script. To him, he wasn't a liar. He was the tragic hero, escaping the emotional vacuum of a loveless marriage to pursue the woman he truly belonged with. He lifted his glass. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, Sienna echoed, her flute chiming softly against his. Across the dining room, the culture columnist from Lux Digest discreetly snapped a photo with her phone. The ripples had begun their outward spread. Everett saw it and felt a twisted surge of gratification. The match was struck. Now all he had to do was wait for the detonation. He had no idea he was already sitting at ground zero. The confirmation from Marcus Lawson landed in Camille's chest like an icicle-piercing flesh. For several still seconds, she stood frozen in the middle of the penthouse living room, phone still pressed to her ear. The air was thick with the aroma of the anniversary dinner she had curated with care, seared scallops and black truffle risotto, now an insult, a sickly sweet reminder of how completely she had been played. The reservation is for two, but the second guest, it isn't Mr. Watanabe. Betrayal was physical. It began as a dense ache in her stomach, then diffused through her body, a slow, cold toxin that left her lightheaded, her limbs leaden. Her first impulse was collapse, to crawl beneath the weight of linen sheets and weep quietly into the down-filled pillows. It would have been the easy choice, the predicted reaction, the Camille the world expected, composed, serene, dignified. She had been raised on restraint, bred for decorum. Her mother had once told her that true class was never caught reacting. But now those words rang hollow, laughable even, when held against the searing injustice pressing against her chest. But something else stirred beneath the shock, beneath the grief, a slow burn, rage, foreign, unrelenting. It startled her with its strength. It liquefied the ice inside her and forged something else in its place, steel. Not just fury at Everett but at herself, for trusting too blindly, for waiting too long to act, for hoping too hard. The anger wasn't a storm. It was a reckoning. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if responding to the tectonic shift inside her. It wasn't a cry for comfort. It felt like a call to arms. She wasn't just Camille Worthington Langford, the composed wife of a biotech mogul. She was a Worthington, descendant of statesmen and Southern Railroad tycoons. Women who had endured wars, depressions, and betrayal with steel in their bones and pearls at their throats. Beneath the cashmere and courtesy lived a spine forged in legacy. She was a mother now, and her child deserved more than a coward for a father and a fool for a mother. The tears that had pooled in her eyes dried up, her spine lengthened. The fragility vanished, replaced by something crystalline and unyielding. She would no longer play the discarded wife in Everett's narrative. Not tonight. Tonight, she would craft her own. "Thank you, Marcus," she said into the phone, her voice now even, calm, and clear as a bell. "You've been more of a friend to me than he's ever been a husband." She hung up before he could respond. Where there had been fog, now there was clarity, sharp and cold as glass. What was Everett's aim? Humiliation, that much was obvious. He had chosen LaRue, their place, knowing full well it would be populated by their circle. He wanted to be seen, wanted the whispers to make their way back to her, wanted her to shatter, quietly, from afar. He had choreographed her pain, hoping she would bleed in private while he basked in public absolution. He was waging war through subtext and suggestion, but she wouldn't be his proxy. She would face him on the battlefield. Camille strode into the bedroom, bypassing the racks of pastel maternity gowns she had worn to luncheons and charity events. She walked to a section of her closet she hadn't touched in months. The clothes from before the pregnancy, before she pinned hope on a child to fix what had fractured. She pulled out a dress of deep crimson silk, a bold piece, form-fitting, commanding. It would hug her bump, unapologetic and undeniable. It was a statement. She was not a fading ornament. She was the mother of his child, and she would not be erased. Her makeup application was precise, a sharp, winged eyeliner that made her eyes cut glass, lips painted in a shade of blood wine, savage and deliberate. Each stroke across her skin felt ceremonial, less about appearance and more about reclaiming command of her image. She stared at her reflection. This was not the woman Everett had dismissed hours earlier. This woman was a monarch, war-painted and ready. She reached for the sapphire earrings he had given her years ago, and stopped. They felt tarnished now. Instead, she chose a pair of diamond and onyx drop earrings, Worthington heirlooms. They didn't just match, they armored. Wearing them wasn't vanity, it was legacy reclaiming its voice. As she re-entered the living room, the private chef, Pierre, a kind, soft-spoken man, looked up from the stove, concern etched on his face. "Madame Langford, is everything all right?" "Plans have changed, Pierre," Camille said, her voice firm, final. "Dinner is cancelled. Please pack everything. Send the invoice to my husband's office. Include a generous inconvenience fee." Pierre's brows rose, but he gave a respectful nod. "Oui, madame?" Camille stepped into a pair of stiletto heels, sleek, pointed, punishing, exactly what the moment demanded. She picked up her phone and a small black clutch, pausing only for one last act. She walked to the dinner table. With a slow, controlled motion, she plucked the single peony from its vase, the one centerpiece of the evening, and snapped the stem clean in half. The crisp sound was more satisfying than it had any right to be. She didn't summon a town car or call the family chauffeur. She walked outside and hailed a yellow cab, the kind of ride Everett wouldn't be caught dead in. City lights streaked past her window in ribbons of gold and electric blue. She didn't cry, didn't clench her fists. Her eyes, fixed on the city streaming past, burned not from tears, but from clarity. The clarity of a woman stripped of illusion, running calculations with surgical focus. She calculated. She thought about their prenup. She thought about Langford Bio's corporate bylaws and the 18% stake she held under the terms of their marital merger. She thought about the Worthington legal team, aggressive, discreet, and loyal to her family for over a century. The cab's rhythm matched her breath. Slow, deliberate. The pulse of a woman about to carve her name into a battlefield. Everett had treated this as personal drama. What he had forgotten was that it was also business, and he was about to make a catastrophically poor investment. When the cab pulled up to LaRue, she stepped out without hesitation, paid the driver, straightened her posture, and breathed. The doorman's expression flickered with confusion. He was used to seeing her on Everett's arm. "Mrs. Langford, what a surprise." "I'm sure it is," she said, voice cold enough to freeze the air. She swept inside. Her crimson dress sliced through the restaurant's golden atmosphere like a blade. Conversations stopped. Forks hovered mid-air. The whispers that had once surrounded Everett and Sienna were now replaced with pin-drop silence. The society columnist's jaw went slack. Her hand darted to her phone. This wasn't gossip. This was gold. Camille's gaze roamed the room, unflinching, regal, until it found the corner booth. Their booth. She saw him, laughing, leaning in close to a woman she had never seen before, young, stunning, and seated in her place. She saw the bottle of Cristal. She saw his fingers resting atop the woman's hand. And at that precise moment, Everett looked up. His eyes locked onto hers across the room. His confident smile faltered, then vanished entirely. Color drained from his face. What replaced it was raw, unfiltered panic. The panic of a man who'd orchestrated every move only to watch the entire board collapse in one spectacular stroke. Camille began to walk. Each step was steady, deliberate. The click of her stilettos against the polished floor echoed like a metronome counting down to detonation. The storm hadn't just gathered, it had arrived. The distance across LaRue's golden dining room felt endless. With every step, she felt the weight of every gaze, pity, shock, morbid fascination. The silence was so dense, it pressed down like gravity. But Camille registered none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the corner booth, and the man sitting there beside a stranger. Sienna Blake felt it too, the shift. First the hush, then the subtle vacuum in the room as breath collectively paused. She watched Everett's face morph from suave confidence to pale dread. She followed his gaze. A woman, striking, visibly pregnant, dressed in a crimson silk gown, was walking toward them with eyes like cut glass. It took Sienna a second to process. The wife, the pregnant wife, the one Everett said he was leaving. "Ev," she whispered, confusion tinting her voice. "Who is that?" Everett didn't answer. He couldn't. He sat frozen, caught in the open mouth of a catastrophe he had scripted. Only not like this. He had prepared for quiet scandal, not live drama. Not Camille, in the flesh, looking like Judgment Day in designer heels. She stopped at the table. She didn't acknowledge Sienna. Not yet. Her eyes never left Everett's. She stood motionless, letting the silence stitch itself into memory. The CEO, his mistress, his 7-month pregnant wife. "Everett," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, precise, carved from ice and disdain. "I believe you're sitting in my seat." The words landed like a slap. Everett flinched. He scrambled to rise, bumping the table with his knee. "Camille, what are you doing here? I thought we could talk at home." "Home?" Camille gave a sharp, joyless laugh. "You mean the house you occasionally remember exists between board meetings?" Her voice turned cutting. "No, Everett. You wanted a public statement." "So here I am," Camille said, her voice steady, cold. "Let's make that statement." Only then did her gaze shift to Sienna. She took in the younger woman's poised beauty, her designer dress, her deer-in-headlights expression slowly morphing into horror. Camille didn't see a rival. She saw another victim of Everett's boundless ego. "And you must be the biotech investor," Camille added, her tone softening into something razor-edged with pity. He does have a real knack for mergers and acquisitions, doesn't he? She tilted her head slightly. Tell me, did he promise you the world? A new gallery, maybe? A life without complications. Sienna sat frozen, her throat dry, lips parting in disbelief. Camille had spoken the exact words Everett had whispered to her not 15 minutes earlier. The weight of realization crashed down. She hadn't been chosen. She was a pawn. A tool in the raising of another life. She turned to Everett, her expression twisting from admiration to nausea to rage. What is she talking about, Ev? Sienna snapped, her voice rising. Camille, enough, Everett hissed. His face was red and blotchy. You're making a scene. A scene? Camille repeated, her voice suddenly louder, breaking at the edges with raw, unfiltered anguish. You dare accuse me of making a scene? You bring her here, to our restaurant, to our table on our anniversary, while I'm home pregnant with your child, and I'm the one making a scene? The word echoed in the cavernous silence of the dining room. Sienna flinched as if slapped. This was it. The precipice. The moment of no return. Camille stared down at the table between them. At the champagne, the appetizers, the evidence of betrayal disguised as fine dining, all the heartbreak, the deception, the silent, endless nights of doubt, the sheer orchestration of this evening's cruelty, all of it condensed into one white-hot, unstoppable fury. With a scream torn from deep inside her, Camille lunged forward, gripped the edge of the table, and shoved. The sound was cataclysmic. Crystal exploded. Cutlery clattered. Plates flew. The sickening splatter of oysters hit the hardwood. The bottle of Cristal spiraled through the air, dousing a horrified hedge fund manager 2 tables over. A serving of risotto landed squarely in Everett's lap. The romantic illusion shattered, replaced by sticky chaos and open-mouthed horror. Gasps rippled like a shockwave. Phones rose. Recordings began. Little red dots blinked through the candlelight. Everett shot to his feet, soaked in champagne and seafood, his face contorted with disbelief and rage. Have you lost your mind? Everett shouted. But Camille was already walking away. The table flip hadn't been hysteria. It was intentional. Strategic, a declaration, a demolition, on her terms, in real time. She had brought their entire life down around them, publicly, precisely. She turned one final time to look at him, her humiliated husband, and the stunned woman beside him, both frozen in the wreckage of their so-called celebration. She felt nothing, no grief, no regret, just a cold, precise calm, and then she turned her back. On him, on her. On the hollow life they had curated for optics and prestige. She walked toward the exit, heels clicking with steady defiance, her crimson gown blazing through the ruin like a warning flare. At the threshold she delivered her last line, loud, icy, and lethal. Enjoy your dinner, Everett. Looks like the deal's off. Then she was gone. What remained? Silence, broken crystals, spilled wine, a drenched billionaire, and the smoking crater of a marriage gone nuclear. The humiliation wasn't just severe, it was cinematic. It was also just the beginning. In the immediate aftermath, LaRue was suspended in stunned paralysis. For a few moments, no one moved. The diners, New York's most cynical elites, had just witnessed something more enthralling than a front-row Broadway premiere. Then reality snapped back. Julian, the maitre d', rushed toward the scene with 2 waiters in tow, not to confront Camille, but to contain the fallout. His face was drawn tight with the burden of disaster control. Everett Langford stood drenched in the center of it all. His tailored suit, once a symbol of influence, was now soaked with champagne and vinaigrette. An oyster clung pathetically to the breast pocket. The murmurs returned. But now, they held none of the earlier curiosity, only judgment, scorn, disgust. A flash sliced through the golden light. Catherine Reed, the notorious society columnist, snapped a photo, her eyes gleaming behind the lens. She had just captured the story of the season. The ruin radiating from Everett was tangible. This man, who curated every detail of his life like a museum exhibit, had been reduced to a punchline, a clown in his own carefully constructed circus. "Get out," he growled, turning to Sienna. His voice was low, full of venom. His grand, cinematic unveiling had collapsed, and like any true narcissist facing collapse, he needed a scapegoat. Sienna, still speckled with risotto and disbelief, stared at him. The man who had promised her everything just moments ago now glared at her with naked hostility. The illusion had crumbled, utterly and beyond repair. "Me?" Sienna shot back, her voice trembling with rage. "You lied to me. You used me. You told me it was over between you. You said she wouldn't be here. I told you to be discreet, Everett hissed, grasping at fragments of control. I didn't tell you to just sit there and let my wife ambush us. Your wife didn't ambush us, Everett, she said, voice slicing through his excuse. She ambushed you. Her clarity had returned, fueled by humiliation and betrayal. She stood up, brushing crumbs from her dress with stiff, elegant movements, summoning what remained of her dignity. You're a coward, and a liar, and the worst part? I almost felt sorry for you. She grabbed her clutch, then turned and walked out, shoulders straight, eyes forward, past the stunned, whispering diners, never once looking back. And just like that, Everett Langford was alone. Wife gone, mistress gone, legacy cracked. He felt a raw, animalistic urge to flip the rest of the table, to roar and reclaim the dominance that had utterly slipped through his fingers. But he couldn't. He was being watched. By them. His competitors, his board members, his enemies in bespoke suits. Alistair Grant, his chief rival in biotech acquisitions, sat a few tables away with a smug, delighted grin. He raised his glass in a mocking toast, eyes gleaming. The shame burned like acid. Everett yanked a black Amex from his wallet and slammed it onto a nearby table. Cover everything, he barked at Julian. And if one photo from this room leaks, I'll buy this restaurant just to fire you. An empty threat. Both of them knew it. The story was already out. Catherine Reed was probably drafting the headline before she hit the curb. Langford collapse. Pregnant wife ends anniversary dinner in ruins. As Everett stormed toward the exit, his composure was a brittle facade over a molten core of fury. He met a fresh nightmare. The doorman had tipped off the paparazzi. A flash storm of bulbs exploded in his face the moment he stepped onto the street. Mr. Langford, is it true your wife confronted you over dinner? Was that your mistress? What's the status of your marriage? Who was the woman, Everett? He shoved his way past them, his expression thunderous. A snarl twisted across his face. He flung himself into the driver's seat of his Aston Martin. The tires screeched as he tore into the night, the only answer he had left. For the next hour he drove, nowhere in particular. Just driving. The city pulsed around him, neon and blurred. Meaningless. His phone was a war zone, calls, texts, notifications piling up from his PR chief, his attorney, his mother. He ignored them all. The humiliation stung. But deeper than that, he had been outplayed. Camille's actions weren't emotional flailing. They were calculated, surgical, devastating. The gown, the entrance, the controlled fury, the table flip, it had all been intentional, a masterstroke of corporate theater. She hadn't just ended a dinner, she had hijacked the entire narrative. Everett Langford was no longer the powerful CEO gracefully transitioning to a new chapter. He was now that man, the pathetic adulterer publicly eviscerated by his pregnant wife. By the time he made it home to the penthouse, he was hollow with rage and disbelief. He expected disarray. Bags packed, screaming. Instead, the apartment was immaculate, the kitchen, spotless. The air carried no trace of truffle or scallop. The dining table, cleared. Even the snapped peony, gone, as if the evening had been surgically erased. Except for one thing. A single sheet of paper waited on the entry table. Not a note. A legal document. From the offices of Worthington, Grant and Bellamy. It was a formal notice, effective immediately. Camille Worthington Langford was filing for an injunction to freeze all jointly held assets, citing gross marital misconduct. A full review of their prenup was pending. Additionally, as a significant shareholder in Langford Bio, she was calling for an emergency board meeting to evaluate the reputational and fiscal damage caused by the CEO's conduct. Everett's breath hitched. He gripped the edge of the entry table to steady himself, knuckles whitening. It felt like the floor beneath him had turned to ice. Everett's hands went cold. This wasn't divorce. This was war. She wasn't coming for his heart. She was coming for his company. The spectacle at La Rue was merely the opening shot. The real campaign, the one that would define his legacy, his empire, had just been launched. He thought he'd been playing chess. Turns out, Camille had flipped the entire board, and he was the only piece left, scattered among the wreckage. While Everett stood paralyzed in the ruins of his own making, Camille was not home crying into silk sheets. She was in a private, wood-paneled office in Midtown, a fortress of old money law and cold, modern precision. This was the headquarters of Worthington, Grant and Bellamy, her family's law firm. Grant bore no relation to Everett's competitor. It was a name tied to the Worthingtons for over a century. Camille sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, and she was not alone. The first man seated across from her was Carter Bellamy, a 60-year-old legal titan with eyes sharp as razors and a reputation for dismantling adversaries with surgical precision. The second was her older brother, Donovan Worthington. If Everett was slick and polished, Donovan was all blunt force. A former Marine turned venture capitalist, he exuded an intimidating, rugged energy. He shared Camille's stormy eyes, but his carried a glint of battle-tested rage. He had never trusted Everett, not for a second. "You did good tonight, Cam?" Donovan said, his voice low and grounded. He passed her a glass of water. "You took back control. Now it's time to keep pressing." Carter Bellamy slid a thick binder across the table. "The injunction is in place by 7 a.m. sharp. He won't be able to move a cent from any joint account without our green light," he said, flipping the binder open. "And the emergency board notice? Already sent. After tonight's meltdown, his image is no longer an asset. It's a liability." Camille nodded, her eyes fixed on the documents. The emotional turbulence was behind her now. What remained was clarity, sharp, focused clarity. "That prenup he always bragged about," she said quietly. Carter's mouth curled into a knowing smile. "He called it bulletproof. But every vault has a back door. Clause 11B, the infidelity clause, is our key." He thought it was just leverage for negotiation. He never expected it to become grounds for a formal review of his suitability as CEO of a company where you hold a controlling, contract-tied stake. Donovan leaned in, his tone shifting to something heavier. "You're 10%, Camille. It wasn't just ceremonial. When you married him, Dad made sure that stake wasn't a gift. It was a safeguard, a built-in check against exactly this." He paused for emphasis. "Now his name is dragging down the stock, and the board has a fiduciary obligation to respond. This isn't about a failed marriage anymore. This is about shareholder value." It was the Worthington maneuver. What Everett thought was a domestic disaster was being weaponized into a boardroom war. He had underestimated Camille, but more foolishly, he had underestimated her family. As Carter and Donovan traded strategy, Camille sat back, silent for a moment, until Donovan's tone softened. He looked at her, the rage in his face dimming into something gentler, more worried. "Cam," his voice dropped to a whisper. "Are you okay? I mean, really okay? Forget the money, forget the company, what he did to you, to the baby." Camille's composure finally cracked. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "He killed what was left of us, Donnie," she said, voice breaking. "And he did it on purpose." Donovan's jaw clenched. "He was always a snake," he growled. "I never saw what you saw in him, especially after what he said during those treatments." Camille went still. "What are you talking about?" Donovan hesitated. His eyes flicked to Carter, then back to his sister. "A few months ago," he said quietly. "At the club. He'd had one too many scotches. I was congratulating him, cautiously, on the pregnancy, and he just laughed." Camille felt the breath catch in her chest. "It wasn't a happy laugh," Donovan continued. "It was bitter. He said something like, 'A miracle, that's what she calls it.' Or maybe just good timing from the mailman." He paused. He was implying the baby might not be his. The air left her lungs. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't even infidelity anymore. It was something deeper, viler. He hadn't just cheated on her. He had weaponized his insecurity. He had suspected her of cheating, used that suspicion as justification for his affair. He had poisoned their miracle from the very beginning. "But why?" she whispered, voice shaking. "He knows." She was talking more to herself now than to anyone else. He knew the odds. 2 years earlier, after a brutal illness, Everett had received a bleak prognosis about his fertility. Doctors had warned them. The chances were microscopic. It had devastated him, undermined his identity. It had been her idea to pursue IVF, her drive, her belief. He had gone along reluctantly, already convinced it would fail. And then, the cruelest twist of all, the secret she'd held close for weeks, the one she'd planned to share with him tonight as the ultimate anniversary surprise. She reached into her clutch and retrieved a folded piece of paper. She'd carried it with her all night, once a symbol of hope, now just evidence in a tragedy. She slid it across the polished table to Donovan. It was a lab report, dated 3 weeks ago, a non-invasive prenatal paternity test. She'd taken it alone, wanting irrefutable proof, something she could offer him to ease his silent, gnawing fears. Donovan unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the clinical language until he reached the final line. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Subject, Everett Langford. He looked up, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. His face shifted, shock, then fury. "My God," he murmured, "he doesn't know." Camille's voice was a whisper, another tear sliding down her cheek. "No, he doesn't. The last round of IVF, it worked." Her voice cracked. "I wanted to surprise him tonight. I wanted to see his face when he realized he hadn't failed, that we did it. We had our miracle, his miracle." The irony choked the room. Everything Everett had destroyed, every lie, every betrayal, the public spectacle, was built on a foundation of his own shame, his own bitterness, his own mistake. He had thrown away the very thing he wanted most, and he would never be able to take it back. At the very moment it should have brought healing, it broke him completely. He hadn't just cheated on his wife. He had betrayed his unborn son. Carter Bellamy, who had sat in silence throughout the exchange, finally cleared his throat. He looked down at the paternity test, then at Camille. His sharp, calculating eyes were softer now, tempered by something rare. "Sympathy. This," he said, voice low but resolute, "changes everything." The words fell like a gavel. For a beat, no one moved. Camille's breath remained even, but inside, a tremor passed through her like the aftershock of an emotional quake. The truth, cold and clean, had finally been voiced aloud. It should have brought her relief. Instead, it deepened the tragedy. 3 months later, New York City moved on as it always did, but the lives of Everett and Camille Langford had been permanently, irrevocably altered. Autumn had arrived. Central Park was ablaze in gold and rust. The air was crisp. The tabloids, still clinging to the headlines, dubbed it the LaRue incident. Catherine Reed's column had gone viral. The grainy, slightly shaky footage of Camille flipping the table had become an internet phenomenon, memed, dissected, and analyzed. Langford bio stock plummeted overnight, 15% gone in a blink. The emergency board meeting? A massacre. Faced with the ironclad infidelity clause, the PR disaster, and unrelenting pressure from the Worthington family bloc, Everett Langford was given 2 choices: resign as CEO and take a leave of absence, or be ousted publicly, spectacularly. He chose to step down. Langford Bio, once the temple of his ambition, was now under the control of a caretaker board led, discreetly but definitively, by Donovan Worthington. The weeks that followed were a private purgatory for Everett. The results of the paternity test had been delivered by Carter himself. The child, his son, was his, unequivocally, scientifically. But instead of joy, the truth gutted him. His narrative of being a betrayed husband crumbled. He wasn't a tragic figure. He was a fool, Shakespearean in scope, the architect of his own downfall. He had it all, everything he ever claimed to want, and in a blind fit of wounded pride, he'd burned it all to ash. His friends vanished. The phone went silent. Event invitations stopped arriving. And there he was, alone in the silent penthouse. Once a king, now a ghost. His kingdom nothing more than luxury walls, echoing with the remnants of a life he'd torched. Every room in the penthouse mocked him. The unused nursery, the wine-stained carpet near the entryway, the now mute piano she used to play, all whispered the same truth. She had survived him, and he had become irrelevant. Camille, however, had risen. She had moved out of the penthouse and into an elegant brownstone on the Upper East Side, a Worthington property that had stood for generations. She no longer answered to Langford. She was Camille Worthington again. Her pregnancy was no longer the subject of pity. It was a story of power, of survival, of grace sharpened into steel. She appeared on the cover of Forbes, not as a socialite, as a strategist, a protector, a woman who turned heartbreak into leverage. The headline read, "The Worthington Rise: How Camille Worthington Turned Betrayal into Boardroom Power." Now in her final trimester, Camille moved with purpose, radiant, resilient, ready. The fragile beauty was gone. In its place stood something far stronger, formidable grace. Camille threw herself into her philanthropic work with renewed force and took an increasingly active role on the Langford Bio board. She proved herself not just competent, but shrewd, insightful in ways that left some longtime board members stunned. She was no figurehead anymore. The day her son was born dawned crisp and bright. A perfect October morning. She named him Arthur Maxwell Worthington, She gave him her name, not his father's. 1 week later, Everett Langford made his final, desperate move. He showed up at her brownstone uninvited. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, wearing a designer suit that now fit him like it belonged to someone else. It was Donovan who opened the door. "She doesn't want to see you." "Please," Everett rasped. "Donovan, please, I just want to see him. I need to see my son." From somewhere inside, Camille's voice rang out, steady, calm. "Let him in, Donnie." Donovan stepped aside, his jaw clenched with quiet fury. Everett stepped into the living room. Sunlight poured through tall windows. Flowers were everywhere. The faint sound of lullabies drifted from another room. It was the opposite of the penthouse he now haunted. This place felt like life. Camille sat in an armchair near the window, holding the baby. Arthur, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, his tiny face at peace and sleep. Everett stopped a few feet away. He looked from the child to the woman holding him. The love, the shame, the regret, all of it visible, etched deep into his features. "Camille, he faltered, there are no words. "Sorry, feels pathetic. I was a fool. I was broken, and I broke everything around me." She said nothing for a long moment, then finally spoke. "You were," she said simply. "No malice, just fact. But your brokenness isn't mine to carry." She looked him in the eye. "Not anymore." He took a step forward, hesitant, his voice cracking. "Let me fix it. I'll do anything. I'll get help, therapy. I'll sign whatever you want. Just let us try again, for him." He gestured toward the baby. Camille's eyes sharpened. "For him?" She repeated the words slowly. "You don't get to use our son as a bargaining chip to rebuild your ego." Everett froze. "Let me be perfectly clear," Camille said, her voice unflinching. "We are never, ever trying again. You destroyed that. You burned that bridge and salted the earth behind it." Everett's face crumpled. The last flicker of hope died in his eyes. But then, her tone softened. She looked down at the baby in her arms. "He is your son," she said. "He's innocent in all this, and he deserves to know his father, if his father can prove he's a man worthy of knowing." She stood and walked over. With steady arms, she offered the child to him. "You may hold your son." Everett took the bundle, his hands trembling. He looked down at Arthur's tiny, perfect face, and for the first time in his adult life, he wept. Not from self-pity, but from loss. A raw, searing grief for the life he destroyed, for the man he could have been, for the family he would never get back. "He will carry the Worthington name," Camille said, her voice cool but final. The words of a matriarch. "You'll have supervised visits. They'll increase if, and only if, you show consistent, genuine change. You'll contribute to a trust in his name. I'll manage it. You are no longer my husband, Everett. You are simply Arthur's father, and that is a privilege you'll have to earn every day, for the rest of your life." She watched him. Not with hatred, not with love, but with clarity. Camille Worthington had survived. She had won. As she looked at her son now softly stirring in Everett's arms, she knew something with absolute certainty. Her real life, the one she had forged from fire and ruin, was just beginning. In the end, the Langford empire didn't crumble from a market crash. It fell because of one act of defiance. Camille Worthington took her greatest humiliation and wielded it as a weapon, reclaiming not just her dignity, but her future. She proved something simple and devastating. True power isn't about stock prices. It's about courage. The courage to burn down a toxic world and rebuild something better from the ashes. Everett Langford lost everything because he saw his pregnant wife as a weakness, never realizing she was his greatest and most dangerous asset. So the story is over, our wonderful friends. Are you still here until now? If you are, that means something in this story has touched your heart in a way words can't fully explain. Maybe it was the betrayal, the resilience, or the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be broken. Let's talk about that strength, not the kind that roars, but the kind that rises after being shattered. Camille didn't just survive. She transformed. She took betrayal, pain, and loss, and forged them into a future no one saw coming. That's not just a plot twist. That's a life lesson. You can be both broken and brave. You can be devastated and still decide that your story doesn't end there. Sometimes what looks like the end is actually the beginning of everything real and worthy. And Everett, he teaches us a brutal but necessary truth. When you act without integrity, when pride overrides love, you may lose everything that truly matters. As heterodoxism reminds us, healing isn't always gentle. Sometimes it comes with fire, with reckoning, but it always leads us back to the truth. So maybe you're standing in your own version of that restaurant. Maybe your table has already flipped. But let this story whisper to you. You are not powerless. You are not what someone else discarded. You are what rises after. If this story moved you, even just a little, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Not just for us, but for someone out there who needs to hear this message at the exact moment they think they can't keep going. Because they can. You can. We all can. From ruin, we rise, and sometimes what breaks us is what rebuilds us stronger.